So the first thing I wanted to do was to talk about the final assignment. This is worth 30% of your final grade. It's also a team project. It's due in on the very last day of semester. This is the final assessment for this course. There are no exams, there are no tests. And the whole thing with assignment 3 is you've got 6 weeks of time to develop your own project as a team, and if you've got an idea that you want to explore, or if you've got an earlier assignment that you wanted to expand on, this is a good opportunity to do that. If you've got an idea that for the bachelor students, I know you need to do the 3rd year project at some point, so this might be a good opportunity to have a look at doing a smaller project, and then maybe you could expand on it for your final year project. So it's due on the very last day of semester, worth 30%. There is a maximum of 4 people per team, so you could do the assignment as an individual, but you don't really get the full idea of working in a project team, just working on your own. You don't get a lot of the different politics and dynamics that you get working in a larger team. So I would strongly recommend working in a team and not as an individual. To me, really, working as an individual on this project, shouldn't really even be an option, really, honestly. So if people are looking for teams, or if you're feeling a little bit shy, give me a shout out, send me an email, and I'll try and match you up with some other students. Or if you've got some friends, have a chat with them, and somebody's got to have an idea for a project like this, and put a project team together, do a little bit of brainstorming, and come up with some ideas for a project. I think given the number of people in our class this semester, I think a maximum of 4 people per team is also reasonable as well. So the major deliverables for this project are the actual project code, and then the project documentation, which is 40 marks. The development journal, that's broken down into the application idea and proposal, a post-mortem and team reflection, a final presentation, and also timesheets as well. So all of these things, they shouldn't be too stressful. I'm hoping that this is a very nice and relaxing project that will give you a little bit of, I guess, exposure to a project of substantial size, but it's not going to be overly stressful for you either, or at least that's the idea.
So how many weeks do we have for this?
So you have right up until the very end of semester. So the last day of semester is the 26th of June, and this is the this is due in on the last day of semester.
So like 5 weeks, I think. 5.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 5 weeks. If somebody needs that weekend to work on it, we could come to some kind of agreement where you could submit it on Monday morning with me, but I would really prefer if that's if we don't have to do that. But I know that people have been busy with the virus, and they might have been busy stocking up on provisions, all that kind of stuff, or moving house, all these things that can come up, I guess, when we're in lockdown, that type of stuff. So I'm if anybody does need a due date much more than the 26th, though, we really need to talk to probably the program leader about that. I don't really have any power to extend it much further than that. But you've got 5 weeks, so it should be plenty of time, actually. And so given that you have 5 weeks, you have to have a project for 4 people that is 4 or 5 weeks worth of work for each of those people. And of course, you've got other courses to do. So realistically, you're probably going to be able to work, 2 or 3 days each week on this project. So you have to put that into your, you have to really factor that into your project proposal. Think about how much time you have. If your project is going to take, 400 or 500 hours, then it's probably too big. So you need to have the right size of project. Either too big is a problem. That would be very stressful, or a project that's also too small, that's also no good. So, earlier in the semester we did some lab sessions around drawing on screen with touch events, and we had to go at making a little paint application. So if you, for example, knocked up a little paint application for your final project, I'd hazard a guess it might take you a day or 2 or 2 or 3 days to do that and complete that. And if you had 4 people in your group, I would probably think that kind of project is too small. There's not enough there for challenging 4 people to work together. You won't get enough out of it. So I guess with your project, it has to be not too big, but at the same time not too small. So if you have any doubts about that, please do get in contact. And so what I'd like from you guys over the next couple of days is a little email from your project team just covering off some of these ideas. You don't have to do all of them, but I think it would be preferable if you could cover as many as you could. So, covering things off like the idea of your mobile application, what it's going to be called, are there any similar applications out there, the initial architectural design for the application, any work that you need to do on it, just summarizing here, any knowledge that you need to attain to be able to work on this. So for example, if you're going to write a 3D game, then you probably need to work out how OpenGL works, and that's not trivial. So if you have any knowledge that you need to acquire to develop this application, you need to factor that into your proposal. And I think what would be really good is to point 6 and 7, just in summary, to just have a look at what you think are going to be easy things that you can cover off in terms of Android, either in terms of any Java concepts that you need to cover or any Kotlin concepts that you need to cover, and then also have a look at the same thing, but look at some harder concepts as well. So, things like event handling, hopefully, or navigation in your application. Hopefully these are things that you would now that we're at the end of the semester, hopefully these are things that you would consider to be easy Android concepts. And then maybe things like developing a 3-tier application where you've got a service, a mid-tier service layer, and a database backend and backend services that might be a bit more of a difficult Android or Java concept that you'd need to research and work out to complete your application. And really, 8 and 9 are also very important and very key. How are you going to achieve this? What's the work breakdown across all the different team members in your group? You've got 4 people, so you should be able to do a reasonable amount. And also to have a look at the risks. So things, I guess risks are all just those standard things, like probably a big risk, and one that everybody else shares, is that you're going to have to prepare for your exams. So you have to manage the time with that. People are working probably, so you have to manage your shifts and your hours. Maybe even think about reducing your hours if you're super busy. Now it's at the end of the semester. I don't know. I always did that when I had exams and things at university. I always kind of reduced my hours when I was working and studying at the same time. I'm sure you guys know all of this anyway, and you can handle it. But it's all these kind of things that are good to write down. Your ideas for points 8 and 9. Other things, people getting sick, other assignments and projects that you have to work on. Sometimes you might have another project for another course and you might think, oh, that's easy, but then you actually come to do it. It actually turns out to be rather hard. So all of these things, put them in the risk registry, people getting sick, all sorts of stuff. And don't just limit it to the things that I've just talked about now. There's a whole wide range of different things that you could put in there. Other risks I can think of just off the top of my head are things you might underestimate the size of your project, or you might underestimate the complexity of the project. So you have to be careful of that type of stuff. So that's the project proposal. So ideally, I'd like to get that in the next week, so that you can get that out of the way and get started with your project. So I won't give you too much feedback on that, but I will be assessing, how likely it is that you're going to be able to complete this project, or I'll also be I suppose I'll mainly be assessing the size of your project, just to make sure that it's not too big and not too small. So if it's a little bit small, I might make suggestions to make your project, to increase the scope of your project, or if your project's too big, I might give you some suggestions for limiting the scope a little bit more. With the 5 weeks that you've got, I don't expect people to have a completely working application. It's more of a prototype. So it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but it does have to cover off all of the facets that we've got covered in the assignment guide, in the assignment documentation, and in the marking guide. So there's no questions as such with this project. So in the first 2 assignments, they're relatively prescriptive, but with this project, it's a little bit more open-ended. So we've got these little judgment statements. So they're cumulative, and basically they increase in complexity. So the first judgment statement, the first criteria, difficulty level low. So if you meet all of these criteria, then you're going to get 24 marks for this section of the project. So, the first one, produce a working mobile application that comprises a single activity, appropriate GUI widgets, and allows users to interact with the application using event handlers. Produce object-oriented design for your application. And you also need to include the storage and retrieval information. So it's a little bit of a hefty project, but it shouldn't be beyond your capability. And it's also a relatively simple one-page application as well. So you get a fairly hefty number of marks for that. And so that's the level of complexity that I'm looking for if you're interested in getting a low mark. I'm sure everybody doesn't want to get a low mark though. You're probably looking to get a medium, high, or even higher grade. And so I guess look at these criteria, right, when you're coming up with your idea for your application. So medium, it extends the low level of difficulty. You need to include multiple activities and navigation between them. Your data structures and algorithms, and they need to be separated from the user interface. And you also need to include unit tests. So it's another level of difficulty. But you've got 4 people in your team, so you should be able to do the first and second criteria there reasonably easily. The high level of difficulty, again, the complexity has been increased a little bit. And that is to include some kind of sensors within your application. So it's not really limited to a sensor. You can also use some of the devices. I'm thinking things like the microphone or the camera built into your phone. I guess that's a kind of sensor, but the way it says sensor there, it's kind of it makes me think of the accelerometer and the gyroscopes and GPS and things like that. But I'm also talking about things like the camera and the microphone and stuff like that as well. Okay, and you need to have a little bit more of a flash design pattern to just make sure that everything's encapsulated nicely, and that you don't have a lot of spaghetti code where your business logic and your persistence layer and things are kind of all mishmashed all over the top of each other. So you'd need to refactor things so that everything is a bit more independent of the other components in your system. Okay, and if you're looking to get the top marks, you would need to use one of those more complex user interface elements, such as a navigational drawer or a recycler view. Both of these are not trivial to use. You have to do a lot of setup work. So you have to have a reasonable level of capability to be able to do that. Of course, your application has to be fully functioning, and you have to make sure that there's no errors or warnings, even warnings when you compile your application. And you also have to develop your application using version control. So there's some, I guess, easy things that you need to do for your project where you can get a reasonable number of marks, a reasonable percentage of the marks. And then there's some harder things that you need to do for your assignment or your project to get a higher level of grade if that's what you wanted to do. With these grades, I'm not going to be looking to tick the boxes for all of the different points that I've made inside the criteria. So it might be that you're running out of time, and you've tried to do something with the navigational drawer, you've tried to do something with recycler view, and it's just driving you crazy. Um, but you can see that you can do something quite easily with version control. You can put your application into version control reasonably easily. So I would give you a percentage of the extra 12 marks for putting your application into version control. So you wouldn't need to tick the box for every single thing that I've included in there. And if you only were able to complete one or two extra things there, then I would just give you a mark proportional to what it is that you had done for that criteria. The important thing is that you include a little text file telling me what you've done, so that I can go and check it out carefully. Because at this point, when you have an application that's reasonably big like this, it becomes hard to explore and look in things at every single feature in your application exhaustively. And it might be that you've used a recycler view, but it's in some obscure menu that I may not have seen on the happy path when using your program. So do make sure you tell me what you've done. And you can do that with a text file, or you can tell me in the presentation. So that's the marking criteria for the actual application project. Are there any questions about that right now, guys?
I'm going to start with a big one, which is how would you suggest we divide the work? Essentially, we have 4 people. What would be the best method in terms of a project management and efficiency methodology, so to speak, to
Okay,
decide who gets what?
that's a hard question, but the way I would do it is it really depends on the people in your team. So you want to have people in your team that have a good mix of skills. They can do so people that can do, I guess, the basic coding, and then you might have somebody that can do the SQL or the database coding really effortlessly. So you've got to, I think you need to look at people's capabilities. So everybody in the course, you've all got different skills. Some people will be good at doing unit tests. Some people will be good at doing widgets. So you've got to really look at what people are able to do, and
We also need somebody who's good in documentation. So
yeah, I was going to say that, but I didn't want to. Yeah, everybody actually has to do some programming.
okay,
Actually,
yeah.
everybody should do a little bit of documentation too, but you don't want to just dedicate one team member to doing the documentation, because this is a programming course where we obviously all enjoy programming. So you want to get the most out of it, and make sure that you're able to do some level of programming. There's people are always going to be some people are going to be better, others are probably still going to be getting there, but that's the same with everything. So don't pigeonhole anybody in your team to just doing documentation, please. I think that's a poor show. It doesn't say that you can't do that, but I wouldn't like to see it, really. I think
All right.
yeah.
I guess I'll come back to this when I have something more specific. We've got a few more questions in the chat. Lakshya is asking about timesheets, and I would like to find out as well.
Okay, let me have a quick look. Can you tell us about timesheets? Right. Okay, so that's actually an easy question. I'll cover that in the next section where I talk about the development journal. So I'll cover that off there. Do we have to use a recycler view, or is a recycler view sufficient? Okay, that's just a joke. Okay. All right, and yeah, so you don't have to use a recycler view to get a good grade. That was just an example. It's just an example of something that I think is a little bit more difficult or a little bit harder to do in the course. So if you can come up with your own idea to also implement something else that is of equal I suppose complexity to recycler view, then you can also do that. But I guess just be careful, because if it's as difficult as recycler view, then it's probably going to be a bit of a pain to do. And you also have to show me that it's going to be that difficult as well. With the navigational draw, that's a little bit easier actually than recycler view, because there's some wizards that you can use. But then when you have to get into the nitty-gritties of how you can manipulate the navigational drawer and all of that, that's where it becomes a bit harder, I suppose. Okay, is there anything specific for timesheets? Okay, so there's no specific format for timesheets, guys. I think you just need to make sure that you've got what you've actually done covered properly. So the timesheeting is actually just what you've done on a particular day. So I would expect that, you know, you'd probably have something like, say if you started today, you could have Thursday, 21st of, so you'd have the day of the week, the date, and also the time that you worked, and then 4 or 5 bullet points on what you actually did. So the thing with the timesheets is that it's normally a boring task. And it's also a task that you can kind of do after the fact, but it won't be as good. And it's easy to see that. So if people come with a timesheet of 1 page for every single person in the group, you know, you've got 4 team members, and the entire timesheet for everything was, you know, half a page to a page. That's very concise, and it tells me that you didn't really record what you were doing as you were actually doing it. So you've got to, I suppose with the timesheets, you've got to keep in mind that, you know, when you become graduates, people are going to be paying for your programming. So what you need to include is just some bullet points about what you've been doing. You know, so I just imagine as if I were your customer, and I was paying you a lot of money, thousands of dollars, maybe $20,000 or $30,000 to go away and build this project. And so if that was the case, I'd like to have some level of detail about what you're actually doing. I wouldn't like to think that you're just browsing Facebook and then billing me. I'd actually like to know you were doing this for this this number of hours, and I think it would be good to include like a total number of hours that you also worked on the project as well. Okay, so there's some more questions. So there's no specific format, but you do need to include everything I've just talked about. Do we need to write something to list each team member's contribution? Yes, you need to do the timesheets for each team member. Can we use manic time for timesheeting? Okay. Well, I'm not sure what manic time is, but it sounds like a timesheeting tool. There's a whole bunch of them, but you don't need to do that. Microsoft Excel or Microsoft Word are completely fine. Yeah, and so Athena asks, do we just label the task with what team member did it on the timesheets? And yes, that's exactly right. Huh, okay. And no extra marks for assignment 2, I'm afraid. So that's timesheets, guys. And then the other part of the assignment is the actual development journal. And yes, the commits would show what people do, but again, you've got to imagine that I am your customer. I've just paid you $20,000, $30,000, maybe even more, $100,000 for this really whiz bang mobile application. I'm not a technical person, and I'd like some line items to see what exactly it was that you were doing that added up to all of this time and all of this money. And the actual Git commits, right? They show a different type of information. They show what sort of code changes you've been making, which is far too technical for any clients or customers that you might have. Okay, so the game development journal. Well, before we go on, the important thing is that the actual assignment, the project code itself, right, that is 60%, that totals 60 marks. The other part is the actual documentation. So the documentation is an important component for this project. And the medium level of difficulty is where I have 20 marks, and that's so that's 20%. Sorry, that's actually 50% of the 40 marks, so 20 marks. And that is really if you've got a very concise level of detail in your documentation. So if you meet all the basic requirements, but it's very concise, then you'll probably get a medium level of difficulty. That's interesting. We've only got medium and medium. Okay, so I think this probably needs to be low. I'll fix that up and put it back onto Moodle. So to get a low, to meet all the requirements for a low level of difficulty, you need to fulfill all of these requirements here. You've kind of, I guess if you get this type of grade, it's because you didn't spend a lot of time on the documentation. You've kind of, I suppose, paid lip service to the documentation. You've done it, but you probably didn't enjoy it. So with the timesheets, for example, it says a concise set of timesheets, but really what I mean is a set of timesheets where it's obvious that you've done them after the fact. The level of detail with the timesheets isn't there, and I can see that you've only got about a half a page to a page of timesheets, and it's hard to really see what you did on any particular day or time. So if you do all of these things to this kind of I want to say satisfactory level, that's the type of grade that you'll get. If you'd like to get a slightly higher grade to meet the requirements for the medium level of difficulty, you need to produce a PowerPoint presentation. That's not a requirement of the low level of difficulty. You need to cover all of the topics in the proposal section and also cover the team reflection. And it would also be good if you could go into some of the trade-offs that you've had to make. So sometimes there are things that you can do as a developer to make your life easier, to make things faster, but then they may not be so elegant with your project. They may not quite implement the original scope that you had with your application. So if you can cover those, then you fulfill the requirements for the medium level of complexity. There's also details on how you can provide proof on the novelty of your application, and going through different use case scenarios to show me that your application is novel. And also provide a complete set of timesheets per group member detailing what everybody did on a daily basis. So if you meet those requirements, you'll get the medium level of difficulty. You'll get that criteria. And again, as I said with the actual application projects, if you don't meet everything, I'll still give you a proportion of the mark. So it's all proportional. It's not like an all or nothing situation. And if you wanted to fulfill the requirements for the hard level of difficulty, then you need to discuss more complicated things. So the design trade-offs for the different data structures and algorithms that you used in your application, the different design patterns. There are certain algorithms, for example, where at small scale they can be quite performant, but then if you scale them up so that your database is 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times or 10,000 times bigger, then it's going to become incredibly slow. So you need to be able to talk about those types of things. And you should have covered this this type of thing in your other courses, but now it's how do we apply that prior knowledge that we got in things like the data structures and algorithms class? How do we apply that here in our mobile software development class? And so if you want to get that higher level of difficulty, you need to discuss those. And I'm thinking more than one for the hard level of difficulty. And okay, this is not a good question. If we have good documentation but no code, you could get 40 marks. Yes, that's technically true, but you wouldn't be able to do a lot of things in your documentation. So you wouldn't really have anything to show in your timesheets. So I think if you didn't actually do any code, I think it would be hard actually to get a good mark for your documentation because there would be nothing to actually document. So that's the third assignment. You should have enough time to do it. You've got right up until the end of the semester. I know there's other things to do, other courses, so just make sure that you've got the right size project, guys. And before we go on with the rest of the class, are there any other questions? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have a APK lying around from like a complex app, like a good app which got a good grade? Maybe you can show it to us.
Yeah, I can do that. I think I've got a PowerPoint lying around somewhere that's got some different projects and stuff. So I'll just put that up onto Moodle. So you can have a look at some screenshots and things from different projects from last year. Okay, so that's the third assignment. Should be, I think, nice and relaxing. You'll be able to solidify all of your knowledge from the course, and at the same time, you'll be able to develop a nice portfolio piece, so that you can show people, potential employers, what kind of stuff you've done at Unitech, and that should help you get a job. If you can show people what you can do, it's quite powerful, I think. Right. Okay, so today we're going to have a look at skinning widgets, and also how to create some drawables using XML files. We'll also have a look at how we can do things like embed basic HTML inside of our Android widgets, so we can do things like italicize and bold and underline, and even do things like create links inside of some of those built-in widgets like text views and things like that. So if you ever wanted to style one of those, then this is a good lesson, a good part of the course. We'll also have a look at 9-patch files, which are basically PNG files, ping files with an extra little 1-pixel border around the ping file. And you can use that extra border, that extra margin, to define some control pixels to describe how the ping file is going to stretch as a background image on a widget. Okay, so there are some XML shapes that we can define in Android, and it uses these tags. So you can define things like a shape in your drawable folder. I'll show you an example in a minute. But these are some of the things that you can do. You can do rectangles and circles, lines, things like that. And basically what you can do is you can assign this image to the background property of a widget. So then you can have a text view with a nice rounded rectangle, and so you can have a totally skinned user interface. You can do things like define the padding, gradients, all sorts of stuff. See, these are some of the properties that you can define. There's a link down there that walks you through all of the documentation for creating these XML shapes. And this is actually how they're actually defined. So it's just XML, and you define the actual shape using the Android shape property just here. And let's have a look. I think I've got some annotation tools. Just try the annotation tool here. So you can probably see anyway, but I just thought I'd try out the annotation tool. You can see I'm not a very good drawer. So we've got Android shape, rectangle, and you're able to change the actual shape to those other options like line, like oval, and those other options. You can also define the color. You can define that it's a solid color. You can also define the corners, right? So this is how you define a rounded rectangle where the corners aren't square anymore, but they've got some kind of radius. This is the example is using pix for pixels. You should probably use some kind of device independent device independent metrics, or units rather, for that. And then the padding over here, what this actually does is define the margins for your text. So if you've got a text view, you can say that between the shape and the text, there's going to be these 8 device independent, 8 DPs between the shape, the edge of the shape, and your text. And we'll just clear the annotations. Okay. Okay, and these are some examples. So we've got a circle shape. Over here, we've got a nice rounded rectangle. So you might have a user interface where you want to have I guess, a bit of a softer feel to it. And so using one of these shapes as the background to your widget, you can actually do that. And you can do some quite ridiculous effects as well. So you can do things like having a ring shape. A ring shape really, I would never really use it, but perhaps it might be useful for a progress indicator or something like that, but you'd have to change the property on that. You can see here that if you have too much text inside your circle shape, you can have the problem with your text overflowing. So that's why it's important to have that padding property. And this is the problems, but I think before I get into this problem, I think I'll just show you how it looks in the emulator. So what you might like to be able to do, and hopefully this is relatively clear over Zoom. So some of the things that you might like to be able to do are to include a picture inside of your text view, for example. You might have a recycler view of some kind of data, and that data has a picture, and then there's a textual summary. So you can, with these pictures and things, widgets and skinning, you can do things like include icons inside them and other images. You can define parts of the text that are bold. You can define parts of the text that are italic, and you can also define some links as well. In terms of the actual shapes, you can define buttons like this. You can define other rounded rectangles. Whoops. We'll just go back. You can also define, it's a little bit hard to see here because of the gradient background, but you can also define links as well. So I'll get into how you define the images and the links and things in the next part, but these are the different types of shapes that you can define. And the code for this is just over here. So just bring the IDE up on the screen. So we've got some examples here. So for example, a circle shape, they all have the same XML layout, right? The only difference is that you just change this shape to be something else. So, a circle, that's an oval. And then you can define properties like the stroke, for example. So we zoom out a little bit here. We can see that all in focus. And there's other properties that we can set, like the stroke. So if we wanted to have a nice stroke around the outside of our circle, we can define that property. We can define properties like any dashing that we might want, or we can remove that. and then we'll have a solid stroke for our background. So there's all these different properties that you can define, and they're all defined by various XML attributes and little XML entities. And the nice thing about this is you should be, I think that it depends on how your IDE is set up, but you should be able to get some suggestions, I think. It's not giving me any suggestions. I have had suggestions for this previously, though. I think maybe if you start typing something, so that's what we had to do. So if you start writing some XML, you'll see here that you get some suggestions for, creating these different tags. So that'll give you some help and perhaps give you some ideas as to what you can actually do. So actually creating these shapes is not too difficult. In the little example pack that I've got today, I've got a couple of different examples of the different shapes that you can create. So when you're viewing it, you need to, well, you can view just the shape itself, or you can view the code and the shape. And you can see here the different properties that we've got, like the gradient color for our gradient box shape. So there's a whole bunch of different shapes there that I've defined, and you guys can have a look at them. All reasonably easy to set up. You just use the shape XML, then define all the different properties. And if you want to use them, what you need to do is to go into your layout file. And what we can do is to add a little, probably the best kind of shape, I think, for this is to use a text view. And we'll just move the, I want to talk about the button a little later, but I just want to move it out of the way. Whoops. Okay, I'll just leave it there. So the best thing to use, I think, for skinning at least, is a text view. We'll need to add our constraints. So I'm just going to constrain it to the bottom of the screen. And we'll just move it up here in this little gap. And what we actually want to do is to set the background. And so there's two ways of getting the background right. The first way is to look down the list of properties, and there's a long list of properties, but if you scroll and scroll and scroll, you will eventually find background. And the second way is to just search for it. Searching might be easier. That might be useful. And what you can do is you can just simply set the background property and then set it to one of the shapes that you've created. So I can set my my background property to that circle shape that I defined earlier. And then that shape, that's going to grow and shrink as my text view grows and shrinks as well. So that can be very useful. Now, okay. Now it can get confusing because there can be a another background property. It's called the tool background property. I can't see it right now though. Favorite attributes attached side. But there is actually a different background property. So when you're doing this, you have to be careful not to select the wrong background property. I'll just see if I can find it. So we've got background tint. I think it might actually be prefixed by something else. Okay, I might come back to that because I can't find it right now, but you do have to be careful when you're selecting the background property that you're selecting the right one, because there are multiple. So that's how you define a shape and then how you can apply it. It's really easy to use, actually. There's not much to it. You just define it and then you use it. Okay. So the next thing to have a look at is, yeah, so this is what I'm talking about here. So there is a tools background, and that's actually what I was looking for, but I can't find it now. I'm wondering if that's been removed. That was available in earlier versions of Android. Maybe it's disappeared now in newer versions, or it's actually harder to get stuck with that. But there are multiple background properties. So if you set the tools background property, it'll still show up in your WYSIWYG editor, but it doesn't actually change the background, so you have to be careful of that. Okay, so the next thing that is interesting to do is to create your own state list. So what this allows you to do is to use these XML defined shapes and also ping files to define icons and different things. So for example, I'll just bring my emulator over here. So for example, over here, I've got a button, right, with this smiley faced emoji. So that's clickable. I'm clicking on that right now, but the button is flat, right? And it's the same for this button over here as well. These buttons are flat. And the reason for that is that it doesn't have a state list. And so it's not responding to my click or my focus. And so it's kind of okay, I suppose, for a prototype to have flat buttons, but it's actually a really bad user experience because there's no indication that the button's actually pushed at all. So it's better to have a state list so that, you know, when your button has focus, there's some kind of action or some kind of change is made to your state list. So, you know, here we've got the happy face emoji, and then when I click it, it changes to the crying emoji. So, you know, you can see that already when you do that, there is a level of user interaction there. Not perfect with this example, but you can see something is changing, and so that there is an indication that something's actually happening. Whereas with this, when I click on it, I can click on it as much as I like, nothing happens. So the state list is actually fairly easy to set up, not hard at all. You just define your selector, you define an item for the state that you're interested in, and then you define the shape. And that's it. There's not too much more to it than that. You'll probably need to try it a couple of times, run it through the emulator, see what happens. And we'll just have a quick look at the emoji state list that I've defined here. And so all of these, it's important to note that all of these, they're all inside the drawable folder. So the XML files, my ping files, my selector, right? They're all here inside the drawable resources folder. So my emoji is over here, and you can see with my emoji that I've got the enabled and also the window focused states that I've catered for. And you can see that I've got the state press. When the state pressed is true, then I'm going to change over to the crying drawable, and the default state is to just be on the smiley drawable emoji. So, you know, this is just a very simple example, but shows you the type of thing that you can do. And I think it's kind of easier actually to do this with just PNG files. So, you know, if you want to skin your application, this is how you do it. The Android SDK makes it fairly easy to actually do that. Right. So the next thing that we wanted to do was to have a look at how to use HTML. So there's this little API, this little method that you can use, a static method, where you can take some HTML, very simple HTML though, and it's honestly not the type of HTML that you would use in a modern web application. It's, you know, very old school HTML where you're using tags for the stars and things. But you can use those tags and embed very, very simple font changes for things like italics, bold, strike through, underline, and things, inline, so that you can bold a part of a text or something inside of a text view. So you can use that to create a spanned object. So here, you know, we've got a text view. We can create a spanned object called test using this from HTML method, embed these little italic tags, right? Which is not good HTML anymore, but you know, this is an easy way to just say that we want lazy to be in italics. And then we can set our text views text property to the spanned object, and then that will display in our user interface in the way that we want. So you can see over here, we've got our HTML. We've got our HTML code italicizing this word lazy. So that might come in handy for some of you in your third assignment, maybe, perhaps.
So why are we using static here? Like why don't we use static for like an array, like in our assignment 1?
So you're talking about the HTML, the from HTML method. I think it's because it's just a utility class.
Okay.
So if you look there, it's HTML.from HTML. So it's just some code that Google allows us to call, and there's the way they've created the API call is that, you know, we don't have to create a HTML object to be able to do that. So it's what I would call a factory method, in fact. So we don't have to instantiate HTML. The difference from the first assignment is that we're not, with this static method call here, it's a built-in API, right? But the other difference is that we're not passing around application state as a static variable. We're just this function is just something that we're using. We're not really passing around the state of what the actual application is doing via static variables. It's just a method that we can call. So that's why it's different.
Okay, cool.
Okay, and then we've got 9 patches. I'll just go into the example for HTML. So this is all inside the same little application pack, and I'll make this available on Moodle. Okay, so the first example is very similar to what we just had up on screen. The only difference is that we've got a link in there as well. So if you wanted to have a link defined, you can as well. One thing that's important here is that because my link includes these double quotation marks, I have to use the escape character so that I can have these inside of my string quotation marks. Otherwise, it doesn't work. But we can embed little HTML links into our text views as well. And then down here, we can use this little linkify library to linkify those web URLs inside that text view and then make them clickable. Again, just using these static factory methods. So that's that one. The other thing that you can do here, we've got the more complicated example, which corresponds to the little Android icon over here in my first text view, where we've got a long passage of text. So there's a number of different styles that I've applied there. But the main thing that's different about this one is that I also have an image tag. So you can include a URL via the source tag, right? And so that URL there, it basically just corresponds to the URL for the stuff.co.nz logo. But when I actually get it, I'm using this thing called the HTML image getter, and what that does is it gets a drawable image. And so what I'm doing is I'm just loading a drawable image from my resources directory. And so we've got some code here to find the launcher icon, right? And the launcher icon should be here somewhere. We might just click through to it. Okay, so you can see here it's in the map directories actually. Not the drawables, but you can see here we've got the IC launcher round, and then there's a different ping file for all of the different resolutions that we might be using. That opens up that little ping file for us. So that's what this line here is doing. It's locating that launcher icon. And then we simply open up the launcher icon and return that particular drawable. So this is what we're doing here, is just loading a resource, a drawable, that's local to our APK. So you could just as easily have some code here to trawl away to the internet and download a file from the source tag that you've defined here. So this one's a little bit more complex, but we need that complexity so that we can get our drawable image either from the internet or from our local environment, our local APK, and then bundle that in with our text view over here. And whoops, I'll just run my application again.
Why is the drawable like cut from the middle? Like, why is there a line in the middle? Get drawable on line 34.
Right. So this means it's deprecated. So deprecated API means that in a later version of Android, it's not the best way of doing it. So if we download the sources, I think it might just be deprecated because I'm not including the resources theme. There might be some default value here. And so now that this version where the resources theme attribute is available, they might like you to use that version instead. But the method still exists and you can still call it. It's just not fully supported anymore. So normally for a new application, you shouldn't really use a deprecated API. And I wonder if we just pass in a null theme, I wonder if it will work. So that might work, I'm not sure. It looks kind of like, I kind of think maybe get drawable here just routes off to this method, but I haven't, it still says it's downloading the sources, so I can't really see yet. But often that's what happens. There'd be some default theme that I can use here, or I can just pass a null. We might see what happens if I pass a null. It might work. So we'll just try running that again, see what happens. You can see here that it's no longer deprecated. So it might work fine or it might crash. And it actually looks like it's worked fine. So you can see now that we are now using the latest version of that API. So that's how you can use some very basic HTML to style individual words and phrases inside of a text view. That might come in handy at some point. You can do things like add images, add URLs, all that kind of stuff. Then the final part is that I'd like to talk about today is the 9-patch files. And so what a 9-patch file is a little file of a button. It's actually, a 9-patch file is basically just a PNG file. And you could do this using MS Paint if you wanted to, but there are ways of doing this with Android Studio. You can just double click on the file, and you can see here that if we zoom in all the way around the file, you can see we have this 1 pixel border. And where the pixel border is black, it means that we get a patch, which basically allows that part of the image that is patched, right? That allows Android to stretch that. And the way it stretches is it just uses the first column or the first row of pixels that you've patched like that, and then just duplicates them over and over and over again to stretch, to allow things like a button, a skinned button to stretch correctly. So if you don't have the patching done properly, then it will stretch in a weird way. But basically, if you want to allow part of your image to stretch as your widget stretches, you put a 1 pixel border around it like we have here, and that allows it to stretch horizontally. And you can see down here, we've also allowed it to stretch vertically as well. So you can see here we've got a button, but it's got a little bit of a weird patch. So we can have a look at the layout, and we'll have a look at which patch it was that we actually used. So we're using the button patch. So we can jump into the source code for that. Okay, and I think this is the patch that we're interested in. So it's going into button.png. All right, and so this is why we have a problem. It's because button.png is actually not a 9-patch file whatsoever. But you can see here we've got another one called button nice.9patch, or sorry, .9.png. And so that's a proper 9-patch file, and so that's going to stretch properly if we put that into our layout. So we'll just come over here and we'll change that property. I'll just get out of the text view. And we'll change this. Okay, and you can see here, even in the WYSIWYG editor, you can see here that we've now got much nicer scaling of our button. Before it looked really horrible, but now it's actually scaling all the different parts of our button properly. So that's the idea of 9 patches and how they compare with PNG files. And I believe you can also right click on any PNG file that you like. And this is the key part. This is showing up right down the bottom, but you can come here and just go to create 9-patch file, and then it will take you through a couple. I don't actually think it takes you through too many menus or anything. I think it just takes you straight into the editor. I'll give that a quick try. Okay. So it's going to allow you to create a .9.png file based on the original file name, and then you can save it. And then, so you could open that up in the editor, and then you'd be able to set up your 9-patch file by setting up all of these 1-pixel control pixels on the sides of your image. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to get the sides, but you can see I've got the sides in the earlier version. Okay, there we go. Sometimes it looks like you have to click into the actual image. So again, you just set the pixels, you can lock onto the side there like that, and set that 1-pixel border, and that allows you to set the control pixels. And then when you come back to your layout, Android will know, based on those control pixels, how to stretch the button. And so that's pretty much it from me today. So we've talked about 9-patch files. There's some resources here for you guys to look at. What I'd like you to do now is to just have a chat with some of the other people in the class, maybe create a little private room or something, and see what you want to do for assignment 3. So you can do that using Zoom, or you can also do that using any other communication mechanism you like. And we'll have a break now, and I'll be back in about 10 minutes. If anybody has any more questions about assignment 3 or assignment 2. When I get back, I'll have the sample code on Moodle as well. And is somebody about to use their microphone? No. All right, so I'll be back in 10, guys. Start talking to people about your groups for the final project. Let me know if you have any questions.
I'm sorry, Jason. Hello?
Hello, yep, I'm here.
Yeah, I just want to know when are you going to do the presentation of assignment 2?
So yeah, great question. I would like to do the presentation for assignment 2 next week. That way you've got, I think some people still haven't finished. I'd like to avoid people getting too much of an idea of how to do stuff by looking at other people's presentations. So we'll leave it. I think we can mostly solve that problem though by leaving it until next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.